Please welcome Ward Dennis to the stage.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Ward Dennis, and I'm an MAS Preservation Committee member. I'm pleased to introduce our next group of discussions focused on raising the voices of people who are too often left out of the conversation. Over the last 20 years, communication technology has dramatically changed our civic discourse like never before. However, many city institutions lag behind the curve in integrating and leveraging these new tools, and even good faith efforts can result in unintended obstacles. And how do we manage the free flow of information to all, both in digital and analog formats? Please welcome our moderator, Celeste Frye, CEO of Public Works.
Thank you. Thank you, and it is very nice to be here this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who has stayed with us through the day. It's been a really fascinating day so far. As mentioned, I'm Celeste Frye, and I'd love to introduce Gabe Klein, who has graciously joined us in place of Nigel Jacob, who had a family emergency and wasn't able to make it down from Boston. Gabe is formerly the Commissioner of Transportation in both Washington, D.C. and in Chicago, and is now a co-founder of CityFi, based in Washington, D.C. He also, a few years ago, wrote a book called Startup City, which deals with some of the very engagement issues that we're going to talk about today. So, Gabe, thank you for joining us kind of on the fly there. Next to Gabe, we have Bellows, who is the co-founder and director of and Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer at the Brooklyn Public Library, formerly also the co-founder of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics in the city of Philadelphia. And Story, thank you for joining us as well. And finally, we have Damon Rich, co-founder of Hector design firm. He was also formerly the commissioner of city planning for the city of Newark for a number of years, and where they revised the zoning code for the first time in 50 years. And Damon was also just last week named a MacArthur Fellow. So congratulations to Damon. So our charge today is to talk about public engagement. You know, many of the issues that we have been discussing today are of great relevance, but sometimes inaccessible content to people in the very communities who are most impacted by the work that is being done around resilience, around zoning, around density. And so we're here to talk about talking to people and getting these very communities engaged in this work. So I'd love to start with innovation. You know, what are some of the best practices you have seen in innovation? What does innovation and public engagement look like today, both online and offline? Damon, you want to start?
All right. I think that in my experience as a planner and a designer, there's always been a lot of tools available for talking to people and working through issues of planning and design. And it's certainly always exciting to hear about new tools, new technologies, et cetera. I have to say, though, that the through line in terms of the real challenges in my practice has been the appropriate application of those tools. The big questions about what are we trying to get to. I have some clients as a designer, and they keep on, their understandable understanding is that we as designers are looking for information, right? And so oftentimes there's a long conversation about, say, the role of having 4 different schemes on a board that people can put stickers on, which certainly can give some indications and give some feedback on directions. But it always seems really important to try to break down how that is by no means adequate from a qualitative standpoint, especially when you're dealing with issues of design, where there's so many variables. And so I would say that the real edge of innovation that still seems like a really worthwhile challenge to me is finding those ways and techniques where you're going beyond information, where you're really going even beyond a notion of engagement, beyond a notion of mobilization, to really reach something where both sides of this relationship feel that there's responsibility, that there's not just information flowing, but that there's understanding and action.
I would build on that a little bit just by saying I think a lot of it's about intentionality and trying to create a real deep ongoing dialogue that leads to like co-creation, as jargony as that might sound. I think in the past we've done a lot of engagement when it's been required, when somebody has absolutely freaked out about some issue that's coming up in their community. And I think coming from working in an institution like the library where we were serving communities that are vastly different, and we have 60 different branches across the borough of Brooklyn, how do we develop an ongoing, deeper approach to civic engagement where it's really about conversations around solving the community's problems and not just coming from the institutional side of like, oh, I need feedback for this project that I'm working on, but how do we start to flip that so that we're actually working together to solve some of the challenges that the community might have?
I'll just add that in my roles, particularly in government, I found that the most important thing was to have leadership from the top, whether it was from the mayor or from myself leading the agency. And before I'd gotten there in both roles, there was a tendency, I think, to sort of shy away from whatever was more than the bare minimum of engagement, whether it's for projects or for ongoing initiatives like, let's say, a bike sharing program or car sharing. And so for me, coming from the private sector and always having to market and sell our services and also to iterate and pivot when things weren't working, we were really intentional about going out and letting people know that we didn't know what we were doing here, we didn't know what we were going to do here. Some things were going to work, some things weren't going to work, and we wanted their ongoing help. And I feel like changing up the relationship with the stakeholders, whether it was the council members or even the mayor or the public at large or the business folks, was really important versus trying to present that like we had all the answers, we knew what we were doing. And then a lot of piloting and experimentation, which you see now in a lot of cities, and I think it's very important because we don't have all the answers, and we really do need the input. And the old way of just sort of having the one community meeting where the same 30 people show up to every meeting, and you just get those people's input. I think we've hopefully moved beyond that.
Well, in what ways have you moved beyond that? In our prep session, Story mentioned that going where people are is what works. How do you get there? How do you figure out where people are to get beyond those 30 people?
Well, I mean, for us, so we did use a lot of technology tools, and this was, 5 to 10 years ago in that time frame. We were talking in the green room about our bike share efforts, for instance, where we would put maps online and we would get people to give input and drop pins where they thought something should go, or they could comment on somebody else's pin that they dropped. But then also we went to every community in the city and had public meetings. So I don't think you can do one thing. I think you got to really, like a private company would, you have to sort of hit people over the head with information. It's probably not the right term, but you have to really sort of go above and beyond, and you have to try a lot of different ways to reach people. I've done radio ads in government. Anything that you can do to reach the sort of non-traditional, the person that is the person that shows up to every meeting, because then you end up with a skewed sense of what people want. Yeah, I mean,
I think of certain things like procurement, which was something that I spent a lot of time working on. And, we don't think about engagement around, for example, RFPs. That's something that this is not broad, super public conversations around, many of the typical civic issues we think about. But there are a lot of lessons we can learn from, I think, the private sector. And how do you approach some of this like a marketing campaign? How do you use different modes of communication, going to different places, tabling, which are some of the core analog features. But one of the things we did in Philadelphia when I was there was think about we wanted input from people in terms of what they thought about public transit.
well, we were asking people when they were at parks and other places, and like most of the time when someone's at a park, they don't particularly want to talk to you. They want to hang out with their family. But guess what? When they're on the bus, that's a great time to talk to someone. They're somewhat captive. They're generally not very engaged, and so we found that that was a really great way of both analog and also putting signs up in the bus, asking people to text in some of their ideas, allowed us to reach a much broader audience than we would have through some of our traditional outreach activities.
I'm trying to imagine some of the feedback that would be gotten from the New York City subways recently.
Me this morning would not have been good.
Alongside the, I guess, locational issues and like where you're meeting people in time and space, I really want to put in a pitch for meeting people where their agenda is at. And I think one of the most important things that I've learned from community organizers when it comes to doing this kind of work is that if people don't feel like they have any chance of changing a bad situation, most of us would rather not think about it. And so breaking through that sense is really a challenge of giving people access to the notion that something might actually help make a change they want to see. So one example, you mentioned the overhaul of zoning in Newark. The situation was that Newark had put in, like most cities across the country, some very suburban type of spatial standards, parking requirements down the line in the 1950s. That really didn't make any sense for a 300-year-old city, now 350 years old. However, over time, in a real process of regulatory capture, those out-of-date standards became very useful for a couple specific parties, mostly people associated with the real estate industry. So the fact that you could stand up and say, yes, like we need a long list of variances, but that only makes sense because this zoning is 50 years old. So assembling a political constituency to start to change that situation was definitely not easy. But what we did was create a Newark zoning workshop that was a kind of a flexible toolkit where we could meet, again, in a location where people were having a block club meeting, a neighborhood association, in a mosque or a church. And the goal of this workshop wasn't just to teach people about zoning and take them out of their ignorance. It was really to understand what people were trying to go for in their neighborhoods, like whether it was shutting down a liquor store or keeping kids from getting run over by wild drivers, and actually start to talk about, in a very specific and limited way, how zoning affected those issues that they cared deeply about. And then it was on them to decide if joining a coalition to try to change the city's zoning was a priority for them or not. But I think that having that chance where people can look at these official, important city projects and start to understand them in terms of their own self-interest is really critical.
I think that's a great point, because another thing that was brought up was getting past information sharing and information gathering to getting to a point where there is some mutual accountability and the ability for the citizens to actually see change, at least someday, coming out of their engagement. And anything you would sort of add around that? So, how do you get there? How do we push past just we need information from you to we'll be accountable to each other to make this happen?
Yeah, well, part of it, I think, is our vocabulary. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm alone in this room, having a history of getting a lot of pitches from the now kind of emergent participation industry, right? Firms that focus only on helping you do engagement. And those pitches usually come with promises like more input for less work, or I think even more seriously bad, the notion that they're going to sell you as a city official a bulletproof process, right? And I think that we really need to reflect on, I think, the insidiousness of that way of thinking about this. And I certainly think back to one of our dear saints, Sherry Arnstein. And if you don't know about her, she was a woman who was working at HUD soon after HUD was created in the late 1960s, trying to work on war on poverty programs in model cities, and eventually was so upset and disgusted that she quit her job and wrote, I'd say, an overassigned and still under-discussed essay called A Ladder of Citizen Participation. And even though that came out now over 45 years ago, it still, I think, offers us lessons in how to differentiate our vocabulary so that when we go into a situation, sometimes it is information gathering, sometimes it is power sharing, sometimes it is tokenism. But that kind of, I think, straight talk is one small step along the bridge towards having those relationships of accountability that you're talking about.
I just want to comment on that. I agree strongly, and you know, one of the things that makes cities great is all the quirks, all the things that are sort of one-offs and strange, and I feel like we're so sometimes focused, like I'm focused on continuous process improvement and making sure things work really well, and the reality is sometimes it's a bit of a messy process, you know, and you want to create as much of a framework as possible that's logical for people to be able to participate. But the reality is it's not always sort of that clean and easy. And I think that there's a real tension there, you know, and you see it. I mean, my mayor's Rahm Emanuel, Adrian Fenty, your mayor, Michael Bloomberg. I mean, you know, you want to measure and you want to manage, but then you also want to let people sort of emote and tell you like what's important to them. And I think that's always a hard balance to strike. And I think also you want strong leadership, but then you want participation. You know, you want sort of and when I say you, I mean we all sort of want the benevolent dictator who can get things done, and then you want to have the sort of bottom-up participation. And it's very hard, but I think people respond to authenticity, and when you're honest about sort of what you know, what you don't know, where you're trying to go, the input that you need, and you're not trying to sort of pull one over on people and just get through the process, I think people respond well to that.
I think getting people like on the institutional side, on the public sector side, to talk about what the problem is that they're trying to solve is something that is not the easiest thing to do from a political standpoint. And I think finding those areas where people can start to learn to really share what it is they don't know is really important. That's not something that like most mayors come into office because they've gone through a campaign and said, here's everything I don't know. That doesn't tend to get them elected. And like likewise with their staff. And so figuring out what are, you know, either it's the key metrics that we can all agree on, some of the key issues that we're facing in a particular location or across a community or a city, starting to get some alignment around the problems and the priorities, I think sets the stage for doing that, but I don't think that's an easy thing to do.
Speaking of challenging things to do, but really important ones, you know what, this is an audience question. So we are an unintentionally a panel that probably reflects the whiteness of the urban planning and design professions more than it should. And the question that came in is, you know, how do we engage with communities of color by, you know, planning professionals who may not reflect the communities that they are trying to get, that they are trying to engage with? You know, how can we do better on this front?
Well, first of all, Nigel was supposed to be here, and he's not white, so sorry, I'm filling in. And Nigel's smarter than me and all these other things. You know, somebody said something recently, and I'm going to misquote it, but they said, you know, if you're trying to provide solutions for us instead of with us, then they aren't solutions that are going to work for us, something like that. And I do think there's something to that. Like it's like we need participatory government, you know, and I struggle with this myself, figuring out like, because I'm sort of known for getting things done, you know, but then also we really worked hard to try to bring everybody into the mix. And one of the things I found was in my work, it wasn't communities of color versus white communities, but we had a lot of more age-based issues. You know, we had older white communities and older Black communities or Latin communities that were resistant to a certain level of change happening. And that was our challenge, particularly in Washington. So I think that sometimes we got to dig a little bit deeper and sort of parse through what the issues are. And I think a lot of it comes down to change management. And if things don't feel like they're for people because they haven't been part of the process throughout, that's going to be a problem. And then I think there's a whole other set of issues, which you guys could probably talk about more intelligently than me, about sort of the millennials versus, you know, people having kids versus people that are aging in a city and what they want and how they feel like they're part of the process.
Well, I would just call out, and I'm sure it's been talked about here a little bit, but some of the work that's being done in New York with the Neighborhood Innovation Labs and the Brownsville Community Justice Center, who are here and who have folks upstairs demoing some of the work that they're doing coming out of that. And I think it's one of the more interesting conversations and projects in kind of this smart city space is looking at, like, in an over-surveilled community, how do you start to bring people along to create the infrastructure and to design the rules that other people get to play by? So thinking about issues of data ownership and data stewardship, and what is the street furniture that is sensing some of the, whether it's air quality or sound, or the number of people that are passing through, making sure that people in communities are educated as to what are the potential uses of this data, how do they get access to it, so that it's not just something that the haves and the have-nots have or are dealing with, but really thinking deeply in projects like that about how do we make sure that everybody in a community is part of this, because I don't think that having 4 white people standing up here talking about civic engagement in a community or a city as diverse as New York is certainly not intentional and not planned. But I think it's really important that we make sure that we are working directly with the communities that we're living in, that we're serving, that we're working in, because we are not going to be the ones who can design all the successful solutions for all the different diverse communities in a city like New York.
Alongside that, as a proud member of the disciplines of architecture and planning, I think it's really important, since we're here among friends, to talk about the severe deficiency of cultural competency that our professions have. And I would say that the difficulty of talking about power, about racialization, about gender when it comes to these issues, about classism, is not just a mistake or something that we've failed to do. I would say it's built actually into the DNA of our professions. When a large coalition of business owners, government officials, et cetera, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s wanted to take urban renewal, also known as Negro removal, planners and architects were some of the people they came to for the euphemisms that justified those actions. And whether we called it revitalization or repositioning or renewal, and many of those words are still in practice today, it was our own discourses and practices, the before and after drawing, that I still have to make in my practice, that were the underpinning culturally to these kinds of seriously violent acts of urbanism. And so I want to salute the people who are on here before us from Black Space, and I think that there's many of us who are focused on this issue. I was lucky to get the chance with some of my graduate students from Harvard in planning and architecture last year to go through a 3-day workshop in Upper Manhattan by an organization called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And they're one group among several that for 30 years and more has been trying to develop workshops to alienate white people from their whiteness, among other things. The name of the workshop is Undoing Racism. But I think until we, as people who have come to be known as white, actually have a more assertive and critical notion of how that happened, how white people were invented, then I think that we're not going to get over some of these really kind of difficult arguments.
All incredibly important and good points. I'm also interested in how working with institutions that are within the communities and that are trusted can help to kind of advance this work. And I think that public libraries are in a really unique position as a non-sectarian, not exactly governmental, and very much embedded in the communities in which they are in position. That was a long set of modifiers. But how at the Brooklyn Public Library were you able to leverage that unique kind of vantage point and position to create the type of engagement that you wanted to have?
So full disclosure, I am leaving the library at the end of this week and joining CityFi full-time. So when I talk about this in a weird mixture of present and past tense, that's why. So I think one of the biggest things in looking at innovation and kind of competency building in an institution like a public library, which I think, having done a lot of work in urban planning and civic innovation, is one of the most undervalued civic assets and pieces in our civic infrastructure that we have. Thinking about, not only trusting librarians as the people who are delivering and engaging on information with you, but one of the things that we were really looking at is building competencies around civic engagement, around facilitation, around needs assessments, and being able to work directly with communities, developing community partnerships, things that many librarians don't necessarily come out of library school effectively possessing a lot of those skills. And from a central level in an institution, a lot of that means letting go and allowing the individuals in every branch library to develop their own style as kind of a community leader, that these are really trusted pieces of our civic fabric, and that is something that in this day and age as a large institution is something that we cannot risk losing that trust. And so we need to figure out how do we empower our staff to be able to host difficult conversations, to bring different types of groups of people together, to use the data that we have on who is in the community and not just serving the people who are walking in, but recognizing who isn't coming into this library. How do we go out and how do we make the library really seen as a place that is open to all and welcoming to all? And we've had a number of really challenging conversations over the course, particularly of the last year, but I don't think this is anything that is new to libraries, in New York City or across the country. But I think thinking about the types of capacities that we train our staff on and what it means to run a library is something that we're really changing, what that looks like, and developing a different type of skill set that is transferable across communities, but allows communities in many places to take the lead.
Are there other institutions that could be comparable? In New York City, somewhat analogous in terms of being embedded at the neighborhood level is our structure of community districts and community boards, which is
say Starbucks.
or Starbucks, not exactly community institutions,
yeah.
but our structure of community districts and community boards. But I think that also they can stand for the community, but sometimes also can be adversaries in a way. And there was an audience question that came up that was also one of mine, which is how do you capture and harness multiple different viewpoints, some of which may be actively adversarial to what the municipal government may want to do in ways that are respectful, but without sort of completely losing control of what can be a messy process. I'm sure there was a lot of interesting controversy on some of the issues in Newark. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think one thing that was important for us to realize is that sometimes it's really important to be in a space where people are comfortable, and sometimes it's really important to have a different space, right? Because part of our work here is, on one hand, trying to figure out just where people are at, what they think, what they want. But on the other hand, it's bringing them to reckon with their neighbors who might have a really different view, right? So in terms of comfortable spaces, I would say, again, with the Newark zoning workshop, the way that worked was they were always hosted by a block club, a neighborhood association, a community of faith, or something like that. And not only was it hosted, but it would be that we would work out the agenda beforehand. So maybe people were most concerned about the way that zoning impacted the kinds of building uses that they saw in their neighborhood. They were fighting against asthma, and so they were really concerned with warehousing uses that brought trucks with diesel fumes or other kinds of emissions. Or they were maybe interested in design issues, like, oh, we don't really like it when people come in and build new things with 12-foot spiky fences. It makes our neighborhood feel like a war zone. And so we had a set of activities where people, kind of like paper dolls, were able to make buildings. And then we talked about, well, if we actually have the choice in our country, because it went to the Supreme Court in the 1920s, to make zoning laws, what are the things that we think that there should be rules about, and what are the things where everybody should be able to do their own thing? On the other side, in terms of maybe new spaces, we had an initiative around some of the open space planning and park construction and design that we did along the Newark riverfront. And our initiative was called 2 cents from 2%, because over 4 years, we wanted to just, in kind of a testing way, make invitations to people to be involved in some way in this place that was off most of their kind of psychic map because they thought it was haunted, or there were bad stories, or they knew that it was very poisonous with dioxin or anything like that. And so we were able, among many other things that we tried, to offer the first ever public boat tours of the Passaic River. For Newark residents, we were able to charge only $5, thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Arts and other places. And the amazing thing is that the partner that we had that supplied the boats and the captains was Hackensack Riverkeeper, an environmental organization. And they had these pretty modestly sized pontoon boats. So it was almost like a floating living room. And you know, people in this world have very strong eyesight and hearing for oppression and exclusion, right? That's one of the things we're talking about, that even before you say anything, people suss out the situation. And so on many occasions, when we had in those boats someone from every single ward, all 5 wards of the city of Newark, and maybe even some others, it was a really novel experience. And it really created, you know, not just the kind of sit on the top of the double-decker bus and listen to the guy with a microphone, but really those opportunities for crosstalk and, again, testing and step-by-step trying to push forward a potential coalition to actually make something happen.
That's great. How do you, so when you go through these big comprehensive processes, how do you overcome obstacles to engagement? You know, those can be things at the front door, like language and need for translation, need for childcare, need for transportation, or they can be things kind of at the end where people start to get real planning fatigue. How do you tackle those types of obstacles?
I mean, I think number one, you're intentional about it. You need to, you know, create budgets for this. It's not something that just happens. If it's that last, you know, oh, that like add-on to a project, I think that's like inauthentic, and I think people see through that. I think from a fatigue standpoint, part of it needs to be that like we are coordinating our efforts, and I get in, you know, certain communities, I think Brownsville is a great example of this. You know, we were surveying people about, you know, the digital infrastructure and broadband needs, and they're like, we have been talking about this forever in this community. We are sick of being surveyed. We are sick of being surveilled. Just like, let's do stuff. Like, come and bring resources and let's try stuff. Stop actually just talking to, I mean, I think that's, you know, people don't actually want you to stop talking to them, but I think people want to see action. And so I think coming up with ways that you can actually show progress on, you know, particularly around large projects, what are the interim steps that you can do that are actually allowing people to buy into this and to see that their feedback is being incorporated into thinking? I think, you know, responding and providing the data, you know, back as to this is what we've heard. You know, if we are doing something from the public sector side, and yes, we're collecting all this information, and we're never providing that back, it's like, oh, I went to that meeting, I have no idea whatever happened. And I don't, you know, that's not how you maintain a dialogue and a conversation. I think people want to know what's going on. And it's not just a like 100% give my information and I'm never getting anything back. I think that's what people get sick of.
But you know, that's an important point you made. I think I was talking earlier about the benevolent dictator versus, you know, getting endless feedback. And I do think that particularly when you have a change of administration, mayor, you know, sometimes a project goes out to the public like 4 times. And whether it's projects I've worked on or as a consultant, and I'm sure you've seen this too, you know, you go into a community and they're like, this is like the 4th time that they're coming to us and asking us, and it's getting to the point where I just feel like saying no. And so I think that's important to go out there and act. And one of the things that's been happening in cities that I mentioned earlier is that you go out and you do a small-scale intervention. You show people what the bus lane or the bike lane or whatever it might be, you sort of mock it up and show it to them, and they can see it for themselves, because not everybody gets to go to Copenhagen or, you know, travel around the world and see, you know, best-in-class design, and you can show people lots of pictures, but if you can mock it up and show it to them, and Jeanette Sadekhan here in New York did quite a bit of that. Polly Trottenberg's done quite a bit of that, and I think it's been very successful. I think it helps you to move things along and then get buy-in for the larger projects?
Well, it's one reason I love being a designer, is the fact that, it's not like, oh, we need your feedback on the comprehensive economic development plan or something like that. That is a huge and diffuse thing, and it really can be a kind of dialogue. And I think we all think about, like, well, what's a good conversation that I had with a friend or on the phone? It's something where maybe there was some information exchanged, but there also were some unexpected things that happened along the way. And so, one example is that we worked on designing a riverfront park in Newark, and a lot of the feedback that we got as we were talking about, like, having a boardwalk was people didn't want to mess with all of the issues around tropical hardwood, right? So they didn't want to see that, even if it was certified or what have you. And so that really opened up for us as designers a whole series of questions. Oh, well, if it's not wood, then what is it? Like, let's say it ended up being recycled PVC plastic, but it didn't have to be wood colored. So like, what color could it be? It ended up, and it's a long story, being orange. And the fun thing about that was that even though we had gone towards that decision for maybe reasons within the design team, as soon as we were in dialogue about it, and of course, some people preferred purple or something else, but other people were like, oh, well, I'm a yoga teacher out in the park, and clearly, someone on your team does yoga because, orange is the color of the water chakra. And and you would start to have these discussions where, even as a designer, having those unexpected comments and exchanges really opened up a whole world of possibilities of what the design would be and what it would mean. The other reference that I would share is if people aren't familiar with a book called Planning in the Face of Power by John Forster. It does an amazing job for a somewhat academic book, I think, of talking about the power that planners have to direct attention. Because one of the ways they have the discussion going is, well, sure, I know that last time I was here, meeting with your block association, you said this, but since then, I talked to this major property owner, and they completely disagree. So, like, what are you going to say about that? And it really is a potential that we have as planners and designers to connect these different worlds, because when it comes down to it, in my experience, it's actually much more powerful people that have been more resistant to this kind of dialogue and exchange and engagement than people who have less money and less power.
Sure. John Forster was a professor of mine. I would highly recommend that book as well. So we are running out of time, but there's a very popular audience question that I think is not a terrible way to wrap up, which is, when is technology a barrier and when is it a tool? I paraphrased a bit for those who put that question in.
It's a barrier when it's the only basket you're putting your eggs into.
I think that was the most succinct and articulate way of saying that. So I'm going to let the genius on stage. And that.
I strongly agree.
Oh, I just said that I definitely know it's a barrier when it's the only basket that you're putting your eggs into, if you know that English expression.
Yeah. Absolutely. I heard at a community board meeting in East Harlem a few months ago, we were talking with folks, and they said, and one man said, just don't put your updates on Facebook. Like, we need flyers. This was particularly about some jobs creation and local hiring efforts, and they're like, we need to know when the hiring is going to be, and you need to put it out on paper, not, can't put all those eggs in one basket.
Yep, absolutely.
So thank you all so much. This has been a great conversation.